I'm Manny Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington REALTORS Legal Hotline lawyer, and this is the last Buyer Agency One-on-One with Pili Meyer. Thank you again for being here.
It's been a great trip.
Thank you. And what I want to cover today are the nuts and bolts of the buyer agency agreement. So that buyer brokers, when you use the buyer agency agreement, and hopefully some of you have already test driven some of the things that have been discussed in these one-on-one videos, but I want to make sure that you understand the dynamics of the buyer agency agreement. And primarily the thing that I hear most about on the hotline is a question of when we have a buyer agency agreement with a buyer, but the buyer ends up not buying a house from the broker that has the agency agreement, what is the broker's recourse? And so it's important to understand that this is a contract between the buyer broker's firm, by which the firm appoints the buyer broker, but it's a contract between the firm and the buyer. And so if buyer breaches the buyer agency agreement, the firm's claim is not against the broker who actually wrote the purchase and sale agreement for the buyer. The claim is against the buyer. The buyer is in breach of the buyer agency agreement. And so buyer broker's firm would have a claim against the buyer. And some brokers are going to believe that that takes away significance from the buyer agency agreement, with this belief that it's not entirely likely that a firm is going to sue a buyer. But I believe that first of all, I know that's not true because I'm aware of firms suing buyers on buyer agency agreements and succeeding in the lawsuit. So I know that that's not true, but wouldn't you agree with me that the primary value of the buyer agency agreement is not the enforceable nature of the contract, but rather all of the stuff we talked about in the last several videos?
Yes, I would agree completely that it helps solidify your relationship with the buyer, and it helps the buyer understand the whole process in a way that they never did before. And I think it makes it less likely a buyer is going to bolt and go off the campus.
Because they have signed a contract.
Yes.
They do have an obligation in their minds.
Yes.
The other thing that I really think that it helps to explain, and I'm not sure you and I even talked that much about this when we were in any of the prior videos, but it gives the broker an opportunity to explain to the buyer how the broker gets compensated. I sometimes when I'm teaching class, I'll use the example of I love shoes, I love to buy shoes, but for all the shoes I bought from Macy's, I couldn't begin to tell you how the Macy's shoe salesman that I like to use is compensated. I have no idea how he's compensated. And I bought a lot more shoes than most people have houses. So if I don't know how he's compensated, how can we expect a home buyer to know how you're compensated? And so through your explanation of the buyer agency agreement, you have an opportunity to explain, I'm compensated because I'm going to do my job and help you find a house, and then I'm compensated through the sales process,
exactly.
right? But if you don't buy the house from me, if you buy at an open house from the listing broker who says this is a really hot property and it's going to be sold by 5 p.m. tonight, and if you'd like to be the one to buy it, you need to write it now. Well, then as the buyer, if I don't understand how compensation works, then I'm not going to know that, Pili, you're not going to get compensated, right?
Exactly. And again, describing the compensation is dependent on what you learned about the buyer in the beginning of your conversation. So if I have somebody who's a real numbers person, real analytical, then I'll go that way and explain it, and they understand it, they get it. But if I try the analytical on somebody who is very affective and not analytical, it falls like a dud. Mm-hmm. So because you've had a longer conversation with the buyers before you get to that paragraph, it's helpful to know how to approach the answer.
And we also did our role play in, 10 minutes? I suspect most of your presentations with a buyer take a little longer than that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Another part of the purchase of the buyer agency agreement I want to talk with brokers about is the difference between exclusive and non-exclusive. Brokers, if you have an exclusive contract with your buyer, that means that if your buyer purchases anything within the geographical area during the term of the buyer agency agreement, then they owe you compensation. Non-exclusive means that you're only going to be entitled to compensation if they buy something that you introduced to them. Moving through the contract to the next topic, paragraph 3 is area. Area can be whatever the broker and the buyer define the area to be. If you're trying to create, if you're using a buyer agency agreement solely for the purpose of creating a dual agency relationship on the listing that you have, the only reason that the buyer will sign it is because they want you to be their dual agent, then your area may be the address of the property. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, as Pili demonstrated in the last video, it could be a community, 2 communities, Port Angeles and Sequim. It could be a subdivision. It could be a county. All of you are licensed to sell anywhere in the state, but as Pili indicated in the video last time, I'm not sure there are any brokers out there who are competent to sell real estate anywhere in the state, right? So
Agreed.
At some point you have a geographical area in mind that is the convergence between where you're competent to sell and where the buyer's indicated they want to sell. That's your geographical area, and then anything beyond that you might refer them out. The last issue I really want to highlight with brokers is the term of the agreement. When Pili was explaining the concept of the buyer agency agreement to me in the role play, and I said, what if I don't like you, or what if I don't want to work with you? I changed my mind at some point. And Pili gave a really good answer. Let me have an opportunity, of course, to fix it. But ultimately, buyer brokers, you should know the buyer agency agreement is terminable by either party. Pili could have terminated it. I could have terminated it. You're going to find that language in paragraph 5, where it says that the agreement will expire on a blank date or by prior written notice by either party. But the agreement then goes on to explain, if, however, I have already, as the broker, introduced you as the buyer to the property that you ultimately purchase, then I've already earned my compensation under the buyer agency agreement, and you owe me compensation, even if you terminate our agency relationship. So much like the listing agreement, the buyer agency agreement is really 2 agreements in one. It's a contract where broker promises to make a good faith ongoing effort to find property for a buyer, and in exchange, buyer agrees to pay compensation to the broker. That's the legal contract part of it. It's also the creation of an agency agreement, and where the buyer can terminate both the agency agreement and the contract at will. They can only terminate the agency agreement and not the contract component of it if a broker's already earned the compensation. And then, Pili, one of the things that I noticed when you were presenting it is you actually stopped and you read to me a few of the provisions. Not all of them, but a few of them. Do you actually do that when you're presenting?
Yes, because some of them I want to make sure I get the actual language. Others I'm going to describe, and because they don't want to, nobody wants to go through all the boilerplate. That's
Okay.
just tedious. But that calls attention to the stuff that I do read.
Okay. The last thing that you actually read was the attorney fee provision. And something that's really important, brokers, for you to know is that only if you use a buyer agency agreement do you have an attorney fee provision to support any claim you might have to make against a buyer broker, or if you were to assert a procuring cause argument against a broker on the other side of the transaction. I mean, a procuring broker who you think stole your client, for example. You wouldn't have an attorney fee provision to support your claim against that broker. The only way you have an attorney fee provision to support any claim you might make against the buyer is if you use the buyer agency agreement. Another good reason to use the buyer agency agreement. There was one more thing I wanted to mention. Where brokers will oftentimes ask me or send a hotline question because they have been showing a buyer a home and the buyer buys from somebody else. And the question is, can I make a claim? I have a buyer agency agreement. Can I make a claim against that other broker based on my buyer agency agreement? We've already talked about no. Where, as the hotline lawyer, I don't have anything to do with code of ethics, but I know you do. Mm-hmm. Is there any value that having the buyer's agency agreement brings to the broker if the broker has to assert a procuring cause claim against another broker?
I'm not an expert on the code of ethics, but I do know that if you have a procuring cause hearing and you have a written buyer's agreement and you did the work,
okay,
it's not good enough just to have the agreement, then you step back and think, whatever they buy, I get paid. You still have to work. Then it's likelier that you will prevail.
No guarantees.
No guarantees, because you could have the same fact pattern in 3 different hearing boards and get 3 different results.
Right. Okay. So the buyer agency agreement, although it doesn't give the broker a claim against another broker, it could be evidence that supports a procuring cause claim for compensation.
Yes.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, that's all I've got. Anything else?
No. Thank you, Annie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here. What you all don't know is that, well, maybe you know, is that Pili's actually retired. And so she jumped out of retirement to help us out with this video.
Just for you.
Thank you. Well, just for them. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions on anything related to buyer agency agreements or any other topic associated with real estate law in Washington State, send an email to me, legalhotline@warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington REALTORS member, and thank you for all of your help.
You're welcome.